Hey guys, welcome back. I'm really sorry for the late upload, by the way. I was busy these past few months. If you're new to this video, I advise you to jump back to the very first one on this playlist, as these videos will make more sense if you follow them in sequence. Today, we're going to create a modal component for creating a user. Essentially, we'll be adding another modal component, but this time, we will include a form that allows us to create a new user. You can make some improvements later on, and without further ado, let's get into it. The first thing we need to do is create a new component for the form modal. We do this so that our code will be much cleaner. Cleaner code is more manageable as it is easier to understand, and complexity is the last thing we want when it comes to coding. I will call this React component FormModal, which is similar to the delete modal we created in the previous video. The only difference is that this contains a form element that allows us to save the information of our new user. I don't want to waste your time designing the form modal, as I introduced you to Tailwind in the previous videos. This time, let's make it more efficient by copy-pasting pre-made HTML code to our React component file to save time. Don't worry, I have included a link in the description below for you to directly copy and paste the code that I show in this video. This way, it's much easier for you to follow along. The purpose of this video is not to teach HTML with Tailwind, so let's skip that part for now. I'm not saying that it isn't important, as HTML is equally as important as the JavaScript code itself. What I'm trying to say is that you can practice HTML and Tailwind on your free time. In this video, we focus on learning CRUD using React as a front-end application and Laravel as a back-end REST API application. So we have this lovely code here ready to be copied and pasted. Don't worry, it may not be the most dazzling code you've ever seen, but it gets the job done. It's simply an HTML code I prepared earlier before I started recording this video. Here you go. By the way, let me turn off this annoying notification bell that keeps ringing every time I click the mouse or press the shift key on the keyboard. Now that we have that out of the way, let's return to our index.jsx file and add a new component state variable. This variable will control the visibility of the form modal. For now, we'll focus on making the modal appear when the add button is clicked and disappear when we click the close button. This is similar to the delete modal component, but with a few modifications. To create the new component state variable, let's add a line of code underneath this one. We'll call it showFormModal and set its default value to false. Then let's scroll down and copy the delete user function we added before to replicate the structure. And of course, we're going to rename this to create user. And the only difference now is that we are going to change this to set show form modal. This will allow us to set the value of the show form modal component state to true, which controls the visibility of the form modal. It's the same concept as the delete modal component we created previously. For now, let's not worry about passing the user ID and just remove this part of the code right here. Instead, let's focus on creating the most basic feature, which is toggling the form modal when the add button is clicked. When creating a new user, there's no need to set the user ID. Instead, we can remove the part where we pass the user ID and explicitly set the value of the user ID component state to null. Next, we'll add an onClick event to the add button and call the createUser function. As we know, this function sets the value of the showFormModal component state to true, enabling us to control the visibility of the form modal. We'll now do the same thing we did with the delete modal, but this time we'll use the show form modal component state variable instead. As you can see, the structure of our code remains the same. And let's now return to our browser and test whether or not it works, and it does. However, now that the show form modal component state variable is set to true when the add button is clicked, another problem arises. The form modal remains visible on the screen, blocking everything behind it. And to address this, we need to find a way to set the value of the show form modal back to false. One solution is to pass the set show form modal setter function as a prop to the form modal component. So let's do that. Next, we'll open our FormModal.jsx file and add an onClick event to the close button. We'll then set the value of the show form modal component state by calling the set show form modal setter function and passing the value of false as a parameter. This will make the form modal component invisible again, meaning we won't be able to see it unless we click the add button. Okay, so let's test this out. Click. Oh, it's not working. Let's reload. Click. Click, and let's inspect this element here, and I see an error. So it says cannot update a component index while rendering a different component. Okay, so let's check our code again to see what went wrong. Okay, let me check this first to see whether or not I made a mistake here. So apparently I haven't. And yeah, let's go back here. Oh, I see this one right here. I've made a mistake. This is incorrect syntax, so let me change that to this, and there you go. Now the only problem is this one. You provided a value prop to a form field without an onChange handler. And so let's go back to our code and let's try to add that onChange handler that is missing in our code. Okay, so we're gonna type in const handle submit, and then we're gonna create a function here, and we're passing the events, the form events, and the form events object, and then let's type in e.prevent default. In React, when you create a handle submit function to handle form submissions, it's common to see the use of the e.prevent default method inside the function. The e in this context refers to the event object that is passed as an argument to the event handler function. So the e.prevent default method is used to prevent the default behavior of an event form occurring. In the context of a form submission, the default behavior refers to the browser's default action of submitting the form and refreshing the page. We don't want that. Okay, so we're gonna put in the onSubmit event handler here, and then pass the handle submit function so that we're going to be able to fire whatever the code that is written inside the handle submit function. So we do it like that, and then let's try this and see what happens here on the network tab. Let's try to, the console tab. Okay, so in the meantime, let's try to remove these errors here and then see that. Okay, so that means that when we click the submit button, the handle submit fires whatever the code that is written there. So right now we are just writing the console.log, so that's why we are seeing that on the console tab on the developers tools. There is this trend, or I'm not even sure if it would be considered a trend, where software developers tend to refrain from putting comments in their code, as they would consider it a bad practice. According to them, code should be expressive enough to not require comments. So while I don't necessarily disagree with this perspective, it has become a habit of mine to include reliable comments in my code. Doing so allows me to understand what the code does the next time I open it. Even after a span of 2 to 6 months, I find that it greatly helps with my workflow and makes it easier to navigate and maintain the code base. My plan is to create one handleChange method to capture changes on the text elements. However, since we're dealing with multiple field text, we need to design the handleChange method in a way that it can identify which field has been changed. To achieve this, we can use the event object that is passed to the handleChange method when it is triggered. The event object will contain information about the target element that triggered the event. We can use the name attribute of each text field to identify the specific field that has been changed. I'm thinking of adding a switch statement here on the handleChange function, so yeah, let's do that. At the moment, I really could not visualize what the data structure is, so I'm just gonna capture the name and the value of the form element. So we're gonna type in const name value and then e.target. This represents the actual field text, the form element. Okay, so I'm just gonna console.log this and see what this looks like on the console tab. And yeah, and to fire this this function, it has to listen to a specific text field that has the onChange event. So in the meantime, let's just use this email form field, and then we'll listen to the onChange event here, and we're gonna just copy and paste the handleChange, and then so that we're gonna be able to trigger this code each time we type in the text. So as you can see on the console, we are able to capture the structure of the input field. So now let's go back to our code, and then let's try to experiment whether or not we get the name and the value of the specific field. Right now we're using the email field here, and that's it. You see that we are able to get the value each time we add the text. I mean type into the input field. So the idea is that every time the user types into the input field, it's going to fire the handleChange method, which will contain the code that sets the value of our component state. Right now I'm typing this, let's say for example the set email, which I am planning to add as a state on this specific component. So without further ado, let's include all our component states here. In our situation, we only need to declare the email, password, first name, and last name states. So let's go ahead and do just that. Okay, so now let's try to set the email value here on the handleChange method. And let's try to set email value and then console.log this. Alright, so if I try to check my browser, oh, I see an error here. Let's see. Okay, so we forgot to import the useState hook here. And also, let's add the use effect as well, because we're going to use that later. And now, as we type into the email field, you'll see in the console.log that we are able to set the value. But there's one thing that we needed to do here, and that is assigning the email state variable to the input field. So let's go ahead and do that. In this context, the value of the email field is set to email state variable if it has a value. Otherwise, we're just setting it to an empty string. So now, if I type into the email field, we are able to set its value. But this is not yet completed, as we need to be able to capture the value of each of the other fields. Since we only have one handleChange method and we're planning to use it for all the other fields, we need to update it so that it's flexible enough to handle all the text changes of the other fields and not just the email field. For that, we're going to use a switch statement. This will allow us to add conditional logic that will make this method update only the necessary fields. Alright, so just follow along. Okay, let's not forget to add the docs. And just like we did with the email field earlier, we're gonna do the same for the rest of the form fields. Alright, now that's done, let's test this. Okay, I'm gonna type in email, I'm just gonna select this, and then, okay, first name and last name. So as you can see, it's working correctly. If you made it this far, pat yourself on the back because you've done an amazing job. Now, the next problem that we're gonna solve is how we are going to actually save this into our database. Since we are running two code bases, one from the front end and one from the back end, we have to make an API request to our backend code. And for that, we're going to create another method that will handle the creation of the user. So I'm just going to call this method handleCreateUser because that is the most obvious thing to do here. And this method will accept an object called userData. And once the handleSubmit method is triggered, we will call the handleCreateUser to save the user data to our database. As you can see, it just passed in the state variables immediately as we have access to them throughout this entire component. The next thing we needed to do is make an API call to our backend code. We need Axios to make a post request. This will be the one that will handle the saving of our user data into our database, thus adding the user to our user's database table. The syntax is gonna be pretty much the same. We've done this with the delete method before, and now we're just gonna replace it with post. So just follow along. And of course, right after we added the user, we should also hide the modal component. So let's set the show form modal to false. Now, for the moment of truth, let's try this out and see if what we've done here is working correctly. Okay, so I'm gonna add a user here, and then, okay, let's try to open up a new tab and see what our local PHP myadmin looks like. I'm just gonna actually make a side-by-side comparison here to see if the user that we've added is actually present in our user database table. Now let's just go to the last page of this user's database table, and let's go back to our create user form, and then let's add a new email and also another new password. What's the password again? It's hard to decide, but okay, this one. All right, so I'm gonna test and then create user. So if we check our network tab, we can see that it was successfully added. So let's go to our localhost phpMyAdmin, and there it is. So we've successfully added this user to our database table through our create form on the front end. The last thing that we're going to need to add in this episode is a method that will allow us to clear all the state variables. We need this function to refresh the values of the state variables right after we've added a user to the database. This ensures that we get a fresh value every time we add a new user using our create form modal component. So let's go ahead and do that. And then let's call this method right here. Depending on the browser that you're using, you might notice that the email and password fields are not automatically set to null. I'm not sure about the other browsers, but here in my Chrome browser, I have the autofill and password settings option enabled, which is why we still see the email and password fields populated. You can actually change this through the Chrome browser settings, but please keep in mind that we have no control over this, as it may vary depending on the user's browser settings. So that's it for today. I hope you enjoyed the video and learned something new. Please like, comment, and subscribe if you haven't already. I'll see you in the next one.